Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. In Reclaiming Jihad, a Quranic Critique of Terrorism, Elsayed Amin shows that terrorism is inconsistent with the ethical outlook of the Quran. Given the recent rise of terror attacks in Turkey, Brussels, and right here at home in Toronto, it is only natural to ask ourselves, what Quranic grounds, if any, do terrorists use to justify their actions? Let's sit down with Dr. Shabir Ally to answer this question and more by reviewing the book Reclaiming Jihad. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're doing a book review today, Reclaiming Jihad, and I'm just wondering, how is this different than other books that we've reviewed recently, and one that comes to mind is Refuting ISIS.
Well, the book I had here, Refuting Jihad, or rather Reclaiming Jihad, a Quranic Critique of Terrorism. This book is different in that it tries to prescribe a Quranic punishment for terrorism. So it looks at the 5th chapter of the Quran, the verses that deal with what is called hiraba, or highway robbery in Islamic tradition, verse 33 in this chapter, and says that, okay, terrorism is similar enough to what Muslim scholars have called highway robbery in the past. And since that verse applied to highway robbery, and they have given the punishment.
In what sense is it similar?
Yeah, well, what he's saying is that the highway robbery has been described by Muslim scholars variously, but there are a few elements which are known. For example, highway robbers would attack people, so they became a threat to people's lives and property. So in that general way, he looks at terrorism and says, well, this does basically the same thing, and therefore the same ruling should apply. Well, the manner in which he does this is that he looks at classical commentaries on the Quran, and he shows some of the weaknesses in the classical commentaries, but he also looks at modern ones, especially one by a certain Darwaza, that looks at the Quran in the chronological order in which it was revealed, and interpreting it contextually, he shows that, well, Darwaza himself had already in his commentary applied the same penalty for highway robbers in the past, now to modern terrorists.
And specifically about the author, what do we know in terms of his background? Because it sounds like, you know, he is comparing sort of classical information and now applying it to sort of our times today.
Yeah, he's an interesting author in that he is the assistant professor of Islamic studies in English at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and Al-Azhar is one of the most prestigious universities among Muslims in the Islamic world. He authored this book, in fact, as the result of his PhD studies at Birmingham University. So in a way, he combines East and West, ancient and modern. He is quite up to date with modern studies on the Quran written by academics who are not Muslims, for example, Reuven Firestone on the subject of jihad, and many other writers as well. So he has not written in a vacuum. He knows how to bridge the various elements of this modern discussion.
Now, how are some of the arguments that he brings up, and you mentioned a couple of the earlier ones, relate to the current, I guess, terrorism climate, quote unquote, that we're seeing today? And I'm thinking of, you know, the recent terror attacks in Turkey, Brussels. We had one right here in Toronto as well. So how do we understand that within the context of the book and the arguments that the author is presenting?
Well, the attack in North York, Ontario, where a young man went into a military recruiting center and started stabbing people, and it's being reported in the media that he said that Allah told him to do this. That would thoroughly be condemned using the approach outlined in this book, because according to this book, the Quran allows for a defensive struggle if Muslims are under attack, but it does not allow for such a wanton aggression against people who are not fighting you. The attack on Brussels recently, that too would be thoroughly condemned, because here we have an individual or some individuals carrying out an attack according to this book based on the Quran, cannot be carried out except and cannot be called for except by a legitimate ruler. Moreover, it would never be an attack against civilians. The Quran is very clear according to this book. For example, in the second chapter, in the 190th verse, and so many passages which are quoted in this book and analyzed carefully, the Quran is very clear that you cannot attack non-combatants, the monks, rabbis, women, children, people in general who are not fighting against you. Cannot be harmed in any attack, even if you were at in a legitimate war.
And what about this rhetoric that we're hearing a lot nowadays, especially in the U.S. as well, of this idea that Islam is at war with the West?
Well, here too, the book goes into detail and shows that whereas in fact it was very common in classical Islamic tradition, in many of the commentaries that he looks at, for example, Tabari, a very old commentary on the Quran, all the way up to Suyuti, that there was an idea of a dichotomy between the world of Islam and the rest of the world. The rest of Islam was called either the world of Islam or the land of war. And
this was back in the day. This was the understanding?
Exactly. This was an understanding that was very common among Muslim scholarship. But of course, that was largely a theoretical position. It doesn't mean that the Muslim scholars expected that Muslim society would always be at war with everyone else. The nature of life was such that things were divided. But in modern times, Muslims have the better sense than to just simply mouth that rhetoric and say that it's Islam versus the rest. There are some who do, and some who attack non-Muslims without cause. But most Muslims realize that that is wrong, and for non-Muslim scholarship to say, well, you know, there's something inherently Islamic about this dichotomy between East and West, that is a wrong notion. And here Amin goes into depth in showing that in fact that dichotomy is not real, and modern Muslim scholars such as, for example, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, has said that Muslims in the West are in what is referred to as Dar al-Ahd. They are in the land of covenant, where you come in as a Muslim, but you're a non-Muslim minority in a largely you're a Muslim minority in a largely non-Muslim land, but you are in a covenantal relationship in that it is expected that you will abide by the laws and the statutes that govern the land in which you live. So you're in a land of covenant. You have a responsibility to respect and maintain your side of that bargain.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit. When I was looking online, someone said that this book contributes a great deal to interfaith dialogue. Do you think it does a good job of that?
Well, that's one thing that could actually be an outcome of this, in that if, as long as Muslims would have said that it's us versus you, then of course that's not dialogue. But if we can move that aside and say that we're all on the same page here, Muslims and non-Muslims together in a common fight against terrorism, well then, yeah, that definitely contributes to dialogue.
And do you find that strongly came out in this book, that message?
It isn't really a push towards dialogue per se. Of course, it does create the ground, because I mean, a non-Muslim reading this would feel that they are safe if Muslims would in fact adopt the views which are outlined in this book. Some other interesting elements, if you have time, we can mention. One is that the book goes into great depth in trying to define terrorism, which of course we know is a very tricky word to define, and that comes out in that whole discussion. But the author also tries to reach an Islamic definition, because he needs to get to the point where he will apply the Quranic penalty. So he has to know what terrorism is. And not everyone will agree with his definition, but his definition has much in common with other definitions as well, in that terrorism, we can point to some of the common elements. That terrorism involves usually an attack on civilians. It usually it involves a sort of political motive, and it is usually launched by people who who are not representatives of legitimate government. After defining terrorism, he goes into a discussion of a verse of the Quran that is often used by people with this kind of terrorist inclination to support their violent extremism. That is in the 8th chapter of the Quran, the 60th verse, where the Quran instructs Muslims to prepare that sort of power or ability which will serve as a deterrent against anyone who might think of attacking them. Some take that statement to mean that Muslims should proactively go and frighten others. In fact, the word there where the Quran says that this should be a deterrent to others, it says turhibuna bihi, so that you may frighten off others. So they take this word, from that they get the word irhab, which has become the word for terrorism in Arabic. And they think that this now becomes a duty of Muslims to frighten off the others, regardless of circumstance. And in fact, a certain group which called itself Islamic, in fact, that's what they call themselves, the Islamic group in Egypt, according to this book, had actually made this their policy. And some of their writers said that it is a duty of Muslims to commit acts of terrorism against others, and if anyone would deny this, that person is not a Muslim. So
interesting.
But of course, that group later on abandoned their view, and they have renounced violence. But unfortunately, that group itself, according to this book, has influenced the development of Al-Qaeda and some other violent groups. But this book goes into detail with that Quranic verse, looks at the classical commentaries, and shows that, in fact, that interpretation is not correct. And in fact, if the term irhab itself in Arabic, which is the modern term for terrorism, is not the most appropriate term for terrorism. To sow terror in the minds of people, there's another word in Arabic, ir'ab, which also occurs in the Quran, but for some reason it's not that word that was chosen. It is the word irhab, and he sees that to be unfortunate, but nevertheless there's nothing we can do about it now. That is the common word for terrorism in the Arabic language.
And what about the title of the book is Reclaiming Jihad? Does he talk anything specifically about jihad in and of itself?
Yes, there is an entire chapter dealing with passages in the Quran that spoke about fighting, and he analyzes them in detail and shows that these passages were about defensive struggle, where in fact they do in fact refer to fighting. Here he takes a very balanced approach, and this is one of the things that I appreciate about the book, the honesty of the approach, in that there will be some who of course misuse the Quran and pretend that the Quran supports their violent extremism. Then there will be some, on the other hand, who will say, well, you know, jihad, there is no verse in the Quran in which jihad means actual fighting. And he sees both as extremes. And the middle position is to say that, well, most of the verses about jihad are very broad, and they would include the idea of struggle in a wide variety of senses, and the military sense only comes out strongly or clearly in a couple of verses, but they're still there. So you cannot say that jihad does not mean a military confrontation, but at the same time, when all of the verses are put into a perspective and interpreted against their historical context, he shows that what the verses really speak about is defensive struggle, not an offensive one.
A very timely book review. Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.